Okay. Hello, everyone. I think we should get going to give our speakers all the time they deserve. So the AI revolution has ushered in a new era, not only in computer science. Oh, my name is Ev. I work on language. I'm at MIT. Has ushered in a new era, not only in computer science and engineering, but also in cognitive science and neuroscience, because we now have models that are incredibly impressive in object recognition, sound recognition, language generation, and more recently even reasoning. And we can use these models as kind of mechanistic level accounts of some aspects of biological brain function. AI models constitute a highly successful species. They have really proliferated. We're now kind of in the hundreds of thousands of models and model variants in each domain. They vary in their architecture, in their objective function, in their learning algorithms, in the kind of data they're trained on, and so on. And for those of us who are interested in using these models to test hypotheses about brain function, yeah? You can't hear me well? This is not good. Is this better? Okay. All right. Well, the previous was a very general introduction. You'll be fine without it. Okay. So for those of us who want to use these models as models of some aspect of brain function, a question naturally arises how to think about and deal with the variety of the models that we have. And a few empirical facts are important to consider in this question. Let's see if this works. No. So something is not projecting. 1 second. Oh, now it works. Okay, great. So in any given domain, like vision or language, there turn out to be many models that work quite well in predicting neural responses in humans or animal brains. And it turns out that high productivity models share some aspects of their representational spaces. This is all not meant to be controversial. I think everybody would agree with this. And then furthermore, there are some models that are now able to predict responses across domains to out-of-domain stimuli. So for example, language models predicting responses in the visual cortex, or vision models predicting responses in the language cortex, although typically not as well as within domain models. And as with within domain models, some degree of representational similarity has been shown to exist between models in different domains, most notably language and vision. In multimodal models, you can find correspondences between the language and visual component, and so on. But again, there are some aspects of representation that remain domain-specific. And I think a key question that's at the crux of all this is basically in figuring out how we think about the variety of models that we have, is how meaningful are intermodal representational differences? The answer to this question is really important because it kind of defines and guides the kind of approach we take and the kind of goals we set for ourselves. So for example, if we think that model-specific representations are useful and meaningful, by this I mean that some model-specific components may align really well with the human brain, for example, and be better than some other model. Then what we should do is, the goal is basically to try to find the best model of visual processing or of language processing, a particular model that would do the best job at capturing responses to stimuli in the relevant domain. The approach should involve something like systematic model comparisons, using standardized benchmarking, so platforms like BrainScore and similar ones were developed specifically for that purpose, for model comparison, systematic model comparison. If, on the other hand, model representational idiosyncrasies are mostly irrelevant noise, meaning whatever any particular model has that is not shared with other models could not align well with humans, then the approach should be to try to explain either the success of any single model, because it's basically an exemplar of other successful models, or to try to distill some shared aspects of all models that are high-performing in predicting brain responses and try to understand that space, but not focus on necessarily comparing specific models to each other. And it seems like there is currently some disagreement on the meaningfulness and utility of model-specific representations, and therefore on what the best path forward may be. So Tal Golan, who's really been the mastermind behind this event, thought a discussion would be helpful, if not to resolve everything, to at least get people to articulate the positions more clearly and kind of identify the key points of agreement and disagreement. So now we're going to move on to the main part of this event. Oh, I never updated this. There you go. Sorry about that. Multitasking is hard. So the next part will be in 4 acts. We're going to hear from 6 young scientists, all leaders in this emerging field of neuro-AI. The first act will be from 3 speakers who are going to advocate the universalist perspective, and they involve Mick, Eghbal, Hosseini, who is joining us from California because traveling in and out of the US is a little bit not trivial at the moment, and Brian Cheung. Act 2 will be the arguments for the particularist perspective, and those speakers will be Jenelle Feather, Alex Williams, and Tal Golan. And each talk will be 9 minutes with no questions, so hold your questions. If you have them, write them down so you don't forget. Then, in Act 3, Nico is going to do the hard job of synthesizing some of the content across the talks, extracting some universal component, as well as highlighting the remaining kind of points of disagreement. And then finally, we're going to open the floor for discussion with all the speakers being panelists. And if all goes well, we should have about 40 minutes for that, which I'm sure will be plenty of time to achieve consensus on everything. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Mick. Oh, I did that. There. Act 3, Act 4, Mick. Sorry.
All right, thanks. Okay, thank you so much. This is a great turnout. Thank you guys for being here. Thanks to the organizers. This is a super cool event. I'm excited about this. I'm not speaking to the mic. Okay, how about now? All right, awesome. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited. Okay, universal dimensions of vision. That's what I'm going to talk about. So I want to begin by discussing how we got here in the first place. Like, how did we get to a point where one of the challenges we face as a field is trying to adjudicate between many candidate computational models of visual cortex. So there was a time not that long ago when we really didn't have any good computational models of high-level vision, and then that story changed dramatically as a result of the deep learning revolution. So I'm illustrating this point here with a figure from a review paper from Nico Kriegeskorte. This figure is showing representational similarity analyses for a bunch of different computational models, and it's their comparisons to high-level visual cortex. In blue, I'm highlighting the models that existed before the deep learning revolution, and in red, I'm highlighting the models that existed after deep learning. And so clearly, these deep neural networks yielded a major improvement in our ability to model visual cortex. Like empirically, this was a major advance. It was a huge step forward in our ability to explain variance in brain representations. Okay, but how about theoretically? Like, what kind of theoretical advance did this constitute? So that's a tricky question to answer because, for the most part, these models were not designed by neuroscientists to test theories. They were designed by engineers to do computer vision tasks. So this puts neuroscientists in a sort of strange position, right? Because we now have to develop theories to make sense of these models that we're essentially borrowing from another field. But there are ideas out there of how to make sense of this, and one leading hypothesis that's influenced a lot of work over the last decade, I think is nicely illustrated by this figure from Doric and colleagues. And the idea here is that maybe what's going on is that these deep neural networks converge to brain-like representations when they share certain key properties with the brain that strongly constrain the nature of the representations that they learn. And these properties that are thought to strongly constrain their representations are their architecture, their task objective, and their sensory diet. like the types of stimuli they're trained on. Now, if this hypothesis is correct, it suggests that what we need to do is to keep iterating on this modeling process to develop models that mimic these key constraints in the brain with greater and greater fidelity, and that in doing this will converge to increasingly brain-aligned representational models. Right? These constraints should cause the models to converge to something that resembles the brain more and more. But we've run into a challenge. Right? In the effort to do this, along the way, the computer vision field has developed a huge diversity of different types of neural network models of vision that have widely varied architectures, trained on a wide range of different types of tasks, trained on very different types of data sets. Some of these things are just clearly different from the way that the human visual system works. And yet, neuroscientists have found when they compare these models to the brain that a lot of these models seem equally good at explaining brain responses. And so this is kind of strange, right? Because it means that these factors, these properties that we thought were constraining the similarity between the brain and the model, seem to not be explaining what's going on here. They don't seem to be the primary factors governing model-brain alignment. So how can we understand this? So I'm going to briefly tell you about a project from my lab led by Cheung, where we sought to understand these effects through a theory of universality of natural image representations. So the hypothesis here is that maybe what's going on is that these neural networks are learning universal features of natural image representation that are largely independent of the details of their designs. And by designs, I mean like their architecture, their task, and their training data. And maybe it's these universal features that are explaining most of the variance in the brain. They're basically largely governing our measures of alignment between brains and models. So to get at this idea, what we did is we extracted features from networks with varied designs. So here I'm going to show you results from a set of networks that have varied architectures. But in the paper, we've also done this with models that are trained on different tasks, models that are trained on different training data sets. The story is essentially the same as what I'm going to show you here. All right, specifically what we did is we extracted features from these networks in the form of the principal components of the representations. And for every feature in a network, we quantified the degree to which it's shared with the representations of other networks in the set. So on average, across all the other networks. And we call this a universality score. So if a feature has a high universality score, that means that it's essentially shared with every network, across every network in the set. And if it has a low universality score, that means it only emerges in specific types of architectures, or in other analyses in specific types of tasks, objectives, and so on. Okay. For each of these features, we computed another metric that we call brain similarity, which is essentially the representational similarity to human visual cortex. And we're doing this using the natural scenes data set, which contains fMRI responses to tens of thousands of images. All right, here's what we see if we plot these two metrics against one another. So what you're looking at here is a density plot of over 150,000 features from the networks examined in this set. The orange dots are the average values in quantile bins. So we see a really striking relationship between the universality of the features and their similarity to the human brain. Specifically, we see that the features that are most brain-aligned are the ones that are highly universal. They show up in essentially every network that we examine. And in contrast, the features, these idiosyncratic features, the ones that only show up in specific types of network designs, they have very little in common with the brain. And so what is this telling us? It's telling us that the most brain-aligned representations in these networks are universal. They emerge under a variety of different conditions. They seem to reflect very general purpose aspects of natural image representation. And surprisingly, they don't seem to be constrained much by these factors that we thought were important: architecture, task, and sensory diet. It seems that they can emerge under a variety of different constraints. Okay, so now let's consider these results in the context of the three questions so each speaker was asked to address three questions. So I'm going to get into those right now. So the first one, are neural network representations universal, or do they also have non-shared features? So this question is easy to answer. they're not all universal. In fact, most of the features are idiosyncratic. They reflect the specific task that the network is trained to perform, the specific architecture of the network, and so on. However, the thing that I think is more interesting to get at is, let's first let me read this question, because I'm not sure I would agree with the wording of this question, but I'll give another version of this question that I think I could give a little more controversial answer to. Okay, are features not shared among artificial neural networks necessarily misaligned with the brain? So first, I mean, I wouldn't agree to that. No, I don't think that's true. But I think we can ask a different version of this question. In the context of the plot that I showed here, we can think of it this way. Can we find features in the upper left corner of this plot? Things that are strongly brain aligned. They explain a lot of variance in the brain. And they're not explained by the representations in existing models and other models. I mean, this is where most modelers are hoping to land when they develop a new computational model, right? Like, you want to explain a lot of variance in the brain, and you don't want it to be explained by some other existing model in the field. So, you know, the answer to this question depends on the setting that we're considering. So, if we're considering these modern deep neural network models that are trained on massive data sets with backpropagation, and what we're talking about are sort of conventional metrics for model brain alignment, like RSA scores, then I would go out on a limb and say, I think probably it's unlikely that we're going to find features in this setting that are associated with very specific types of model classes and aren't seen in other types of DNNs. And that's just because I think there are many different ways with these deep neural networks to arrive at brain-aligned representations. Right? There's not one architecture, there's not one task, there's not one training data set that gets you there. Okay, the third question, what empirical tests would adjudicate this debate? Well, I have to say, I don't think we should see the universalist and particularist perspectives as mutually exclusive from one another. I think they just provide different insights into the representations that we're trying to characterize. I think the data shows that universal representations exist, and they're an important part of the story, but that doesn't mean we should give up on trying to understand the role of these constraints in neuroscience. To give a concrete example, I think if we want to move beyond studying these sort of state-of-the-art models that we're grabbing from the AI world, and instead understand how visual representations emerge under more biologically plausible conditions, I think to get an answer to this, architecture, learning objective, and sensory diet are probably going to be crucial. And in fact, these are some of the questions that we're going after in my lab right now. So my argument isn't that we should give up on the particularist perspective and ignore the role of these factors in the brain. My argument is that there's another part of the story here, which is these universal representations. These are things that are surprising. They weren't predicted by our previous theories. They seem to be central to understanding the relationship between the brain and deep neural network models. They explain a lot of the shared variance between these systems. And I think most excitingly, they point to something really fundamental about the nature of natural image representations that we don't understand yet. And if we want to get to an understanding of these things, it requires a different approach than what a lot of the work in the field has been doing recently. Instead of trying to focus on the differences across models and tease apart these differences, it requires us to pay attention to the things that are shared across the models. So thank you for your attention.
Eghbal, say something?
Yes, hi.
Great.
Does my voice come through? All right, now I think you're muted. Could you just...
We can hear you, Will.
Okay, great. I'm just going to start then. Okay. Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank the organizers for bringing together people for this session, and I'm excited to share with you our recent work on the universality of representation in biological and artificial neural networks. So one of the approaches in computational and cognitive neuroscience is to build computational models that can predict and help us explain brain responses in perceptual and cognitive systems such as language and vision. And across both domains, we now have a diverse set of artificial neural networks that predict brain responses to similar degrees. These high-performing ANNs differ in their architecture, training data, and objective. And if you want to use these models to develop a computational account of the activity in different brain regions and move towards explanations, we need to know that not just that they bear some similarity to the brain, but what makes them similar. And here we ask, why do different ANNs align with the brain? So to build some intuition, let's think about language network in a simplified setting. Let's say we have 3 natural sentences shown in circles here, and the brain representation for these sentences has the following shape. And this is a very simple illustration of a representational space. Also, let's say we have 3 language models which show good brain alignment to language network, and sort of these models based on our tests provide good models of the language network. However, if we consider strong inference paradigm, we need models to provide distinct hypotheses for the same sets of stimuli. And these natural sentences just don't provide the right testing condition. They don't stress test the models. So let's say we find a set of natural sentences whose representation differ across models. What should we expect? If one of these models is a better model of the language network under these stress testing conditions, it would come out as a winner, and its representation remains similar to the human language network. But the representation for the other 2 models would diverge. Well, how can we find natural stimuli that are represented differently across the models? This is important because in the case of the language network, it is quite sensitive to natural sentences and doesn't show reliable activation for unnatural strings. So without getting into too much details, we develop a simple method with 4 critical steps. We first have a model set. Here we use ANNs that are high performing and predicting brain responses for an independent data set. Then we have a natural stimulus set, which we carefully create using large set of stimuli, and we sample from these stimulus set. And then we define a model hypothesis. For each model, we define the representational similarity over a set of stimuli as our model hypothesis. But of course, one can pick a different hypothesis as the model hypothesis. And then the 4th step is optimizing for low agreement across model hypotheses, finding a subset of stimuli that minimizes the pairwise model representational similarities. And we iteratively sample from our natural stimulus set to minimize the representational similarity across all model pairs and arrive at a low agreement sentence set. And what do we expect to see in these new sets? Based on our setup, we expect 1 or a couple models to come out as winners. They should be able to predict brain responses to these low agreement sentences better than other models. And this is what we thought should happen. But surprisingly, we find that all of the 7 models struggle to predict brain responses to these low agreement sentences, and they yield low brain predictivity, and this is evident by the large gap between the computed ceiling for these fMRI responses in dashed lines and the predictivity for the models. And for comparison, here's the predictivity for a set of sentences from the prior benchmark, which is the prior data set. So here, for these prior data set, the model predictivity is close to the computed ceiling. So instead, we are finding that no models provide a good representation for the language network in these low agreement set. So what does this mean? It appears that by pushing the model representations away from each other, we also push them away from a brain-like representation. And one can hypothesize that if we instead push the model representations toward each other, we should expect them to be more brain-like. So going back to our simplified diagram, if we select a set of low agreement stimuli and compare them to the brain, we get low prediction of the brain responses. And importantly, if we were to select a set of high agreement stimuli across models, then when we compare them to the brain, we should expect high prediction per model. So we can think of this hypothesis as a representation or universality hypothesis. And in a sense, there can be many models that by virtue of training on language statistics arrive at similar representational space. And this space is similar to that of humans. And the stimuli that are in agreement across models reveal this shared representational space. And of course, if the hypothesis is not correct or the representation agreement measure that we constructed is not related to model brain alignment, we shouldn't see this modulation based on stimulus set. So here's what we found when we measure brain alignment for these three sets of sentences. Let's focus on one model. We notice that the predictivity for high agreement sentences is highest, then random, and the predictivity for low agreement sentences is the lowest. And if we compare this pattern to the model agreement, we see the resemblance. And overall, for 5 of the 7 models, the neural responses to sentences in high agreement sets are predicted better than low agreement sets. And this provides a more direct evidence for representation universality hypothesis. Does this generalize to visual domain? We can again sample image sets that show different degrees of agreement across high-performing vision models. And similar to what we saw for language, neural responses to high agreement images were predicted best, followed by random, and lowest for low agreement images. So in effect, representational convergence generalizes to visual ANNs and brain visual representation. So low representational agreement across ANNs lead to divergence from brain representation, and high representational agreement among ANNs lead to convergence with brain representation. So the similarity between artificial and biological neural networks arise from a universal representation they both learn. And going to the question, the first question, I think to answer this question, I think it depends on what sets of stimuli are used to elicit representation. Certain stimuli could highlight parts of the representation that need to be learned to capture essential features of the training data distribution, regardless of the architecture, objective, or learning rule. And such features should be invariant to model details, and importantly, they should be predictive of model performance. And as for the correspondence between models and the brain, I think we should expect a partial degree of overlap. Artificial and biological systems are undoubtedly different from each other. One is evolved with its sets of computational goals and constrained, while the other one is an artifact with specific computational goals designed by researchers. And to the extent that there is an overlap in goals, constraint, and most importantly, their training data, we should expect overlap in the resulting representations and computation. And to answer the third question, or at least provide some viewpoints on it, what empirical tests would adjudicate this debate, I'm somewhat agnostic to whether we can truly settle the binary contrast between universal and particular representation. I think we need to design empirical tests that map out where different systems fall in the continuum between the two poles. First, we need to refine our criteria by comparing two systems. For example, we considered a stricter test like bidirectionality and tested whether image sets that cause high and low agreement across human fMRI activations can cause high and low agreement across models. So we sort of avoided doing any sort of encoding. And second, we must extend our test beyond representations to behavior. So a key point for us was to check if our high and low agreement stimuli produce similar trends, at least in some human perceptual rating. And this connects model internal states to behavior, be it in a coarse way, but that's a starting point for us. And with that, I'd like to hear what other speakers, panelists, and the audience think. Thank you.
Thank you. So hello, everyone. I'm Brian. I'm currently at MIT, and next year I'll be at UCSF. And I want to thank the organizers, again, for inviting me to this great workshop. And today I'll talk about, I think, similar themes to what people, Michael and Eghbal has just mentioned, the notion of universality. And I'll talk about it from more the AI side, I'd say, from the idea of convergence across different kinds of intelligence, not only biological like the brain, but also intelligences in different domains of AI. Thank you. So to talk about this, I wanted to kind of go through the questions. And to do this, I want to kind of give you a conceptual diagram. And the idea here is that I'll show you this idea of the space of capabilities and the things that are shared among natural intelligences like brains, and the space of capabilities also shared among artificial intelligence. And I think the question that maybe we're all interested in is whether this trend is something that has increasing overlap or decreasing overlap. And that tells us, whether we're kind of looking only at the intersection or potentially at the two disjoint areas in each of these capability circles, right? And in our work last year, we showed that across, two circles, let's say the vision circle and the language circle, as language models get better at, doing language tasks, modeled by the x-axis here, whereas language models go from low performance to high performance, you'll see that they align better to vision models, a completely different domain, right? And you can see that the same is also true for different vision models. As you go from dino small to dino space to dino large to dino giant, you see the alignment also correspondingly increases. So as you go from weaker to stronger language models, and also from weaker to stronger vision models, you see the overlap actually increase. And the reason why we think this is happening in this domain is this idea that the vision domain and the language domain are both just projections of the same, what we call Platonic ideal in some sense, where they basically represent the same representation across different domains, where you see the causal factor Z here being represented in the visual domain like a 2D grid over an image, and also being described potentially via caption and text. To give you kind of a notion of whether universality or particularity exists, I want to give you a thought experiment. And this thought experiment I would call the beneficial misalignment to the brain. And what I mean by this is that let's say you had a bunch of different AI models, and let's say they were in this capability space here, capability A and capability B. And you go from GPT-2, let's say, which is not necessarily a very good model in many capabilities, but is interesting anyway, and you, let's say, go to GPT-5. Now, I made this slide before GPT-5 came out, so maybe some people might disagree on where that actually sits. But let's say it sits there for now. Now, as you can see, as you go from this weaker model to a stronger model, you might actually have some capabilities that are actually, in fact, better in GPT-5 that are surpassing maybe certain abilities that the brain can do. Similarly, what about, maybe in a few years, GPT-8? Where will that be? And finally, we know, and we've all heard of AlphaGo, right? And obviously in the domain of Go, in the capability of Go, it actually does surpass humans. So as we go from capabilities from GPT-2 to all these other models, what happens and what would we expect to see from misalignment or alignment? So let's say you go from the capability of the gray X to the blue X here. What you'll see is that, or what I expect to see is this notion that the alignment might increase initially as you get closer to the brain, but what if it goes down? And I think this is an interesting aspect that we have to account for because maybe this is already happening. So this is a plot of brain score, and on the x-axis is, image model capability, in this case, ImageNet top 1 accuracy, and this is the productivity to monkey IT cortex. And you can see as you get to a certain level of performance on ImageNet, you might get a saturation effect and maybe even a little bit of a decrease. And the question is, well, why is this happening? Because I think when people read our paper, they often think that the alignment that we're talking about is alignment necessarily to all systems, and particularly the brains. But our hypothesis isn't specifically about just aligning machines to humans. It's actually about intelligences aligning to each other as they become more capable. And this is an important distinction. So in the space of capabilities, as vision models become more capable, and as language models become more capable, the overlapping that we see in the trends of the Platonic representation hypothesis is that they're increasing in alignment. Now, we always talk about this notion of biologically inspired, artificial intelligence, right? But I also want to present some other alternative, which is artificially inspired natural intelligence. And there was a paper, actually, that was written from a Tom Griffith's group, where what they studied was this notion of, how superhuman intelligences actually change human decision quality, specifically in the game of Go. And what they found was this aspect that as you go from the recorded games of Go from 1950 to 2021, you'll see that when AlphaGo came out in March 2016, there was a drastic change in how humans played Go. Specifically, their decision quality actually went up substantially, meaning that their quality of how optimal their moves were actually substantially increased. But what they also found was that the novelty of the moves that they made were also much higher. I think this is an interesting dynamic because I think we're going to see this potentially more often in the future. And in this case, the space of capabilities of natural intelligence is actually moving closer and overlapping with the space of artificial intelligence, I would say. So I think we all assumed that, the circle on the right would be the one that moves around, right? But, potentially in the future, maybe the circle on the left also can move around as well, increasing or decreasing in overlap. Now, I also want to ask, well, what if AI acquires more domain-specific capabilities? Meaning, what if the artificial intelligence gains capabilities that we as natural agents do not have, but the AI models do have? What happens to alignment then? And is it a proportion of how much overlap is in the intersection versus how much is actually external? Are the particularities of the representation space actually going to increase faster than the things that overlap? And to answer one of the questions, which is what empirical tests would adjudicate this debate, I would argue that maybe we should look at not necessarily a desirable alignment between the brain and machines, but maybe the desirable properties of representations in general. What are the universal properties we want in our representations? Regardless of matching to the brain, some might argue that representations should be consistent across different views, easy to read out via a linear layer, or maybe transfer as well to downstream tasks. Now, like I said, what experiments will change with superintelligence? The notion that there are certain capabilities that these models have that are beyond our own abilities. And I argue that maybe we should look at necessarily aligning just representations and features to potentially aligning goals, probing goal representations, whether through stimuli, meaning that you probe representations and out-of-distribution data like adversarial inputs, or whether we have metrics that are more goal-aligned rather than just representationally aligned, like metrics like verification now. Although I don't think that's the strongest metric that we have today, we should think of better ones. And then also incentive alignment, how these models will behave as collectives and whether they're aligned to our behaviors as well. Because I think we need to actually have identifiability on the plot on the right side. And I argue that alignment to goals might be a more general way to look at alignment that generalizes to the future when there are certain capabilities that these models might gain that we would like to have, that we do not have, but are still aligned to our goals. Thanks.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenelle. I am just starting at Carnegie Mellon University as an assistant professor this fall. And today I'm going to start off, I guess, the particularity set of talks, focusing on optimizing stimuli to test models of perception. And so many experiments rely on testing models with sets of natural sounds or images, but we can potentially synthesize stimuli that target specific hypotheses, which some people have sort of pointed to in the first set of talks. And so I couldn't really decide exactly what I wanted to talk about today, so I'm going to be very ambitious and try and tell you about 3 different sets of projects. So we're going to start off talking about model metamers. Model metamers are stimuli that are physically distinct, but that produce the same responses within a computational model. So these stimuli really test what the model is invariant to. These model metamers are a sample from the set of stimuli that evoke the same representation in the model. And so when we synthesize stimuli from what is here a standard trained visual neural network model, they often look like the stimuli that we're seeing here. Stimuli generated from deep layers of the model don't look anything like the original stimulus. They look like noise. And then if we have humans try and classify these stimuli, we see that they are no longer able to classify these stimuli as the same as the natural image, even though the model is sort of equally confident and it says that these models appear to be the same. And so this, if you've seen me give a talk before, or if you've read this paper, you'll know that we've really highlighted this as a fundamental problem with a lot of the machine learning models that we have today. But we found that with some types of training, stimuli can in fact become more human recognizable. In this case, the model is trained to reduce susceptibility to adversarial examples. And so in this model, the invariances become more aligned with human observers. Now, we can use this type of an experiment in order to test whether the invariances of models are shared with human observers. But we can also use this experiment to test whether the invariances of one model are shared with other neural network models. And so the way that we're going to do this is basically take one model, and we're going to call this our metamer generation model. And we generate these synthetic stimuli from many different layers of the model in the same way that I showed on the previous slide. Now, all of these are, in this case, an image, right? We're going back to the input space. And so we can then take this image and feed it in to another model. And we can get that model to perform a classification task on this image and measure the performance. We're going to repeat this procedure each time for one of our, for another neural network model. And then we can take the average across these other recognition models, basically to see how well the metamers from one model are shared with other models. And so if metamers are always shared across the model, then the invariances are universal. So what we find from this is actually that standard classification models and also models trained with self-supervision have metamers that are simply not shared across models. What this means is that the models really have idiosyncratic invariances. They have invariances that are very specific to just that particular model. And I also want to highlight here that oftentimes these metamers are not actually just shared, are not actually idiosyncratic to, say, the architecture or the training data set. Oftentimes, they're not even shared across the same model, trained on the same data set, but with a different random initialization seed. And so it's actually really easy to train a model and then develop these idiosyncratic invariances. But what we noticed in this paper is that the adversarially trained network also has more recognizable model metamers by our other models. And so really this shows that adversarial training removes many of these model-specific invariances. Now what's really interesting here is that these model performance curves look very similar to the human recognition curves that we also measured on exactly the same stimuli. And in fact, the human recognition performance on the model metamers and other model recognition performance on the model metamers are really quite correlated, which suggests that when one model shares invariances with other models, it's also going to share invariances with human observers. This is the case in the vision domain, and we also showed that this is the case for a bunch of audio models. And so this actually seems like evidence for both universality and particularity. On one hand, many of our models have idiosyncratic invariances. But if we're able to nail down the right model, which was also talked about in some of the previous talks, maybe we can nail down the right model. And then this right model actually has shared invariances with many other models, and also it happens to share invariances with the brain. So maybe one of these models is actually capturing some sort of universal invariances. However, it's actually really hard to find what that right model is, especially when we are testing things on natural stimuli. And so this gets into the second project that I want to go through today, which was actually presented as a poster yesterday here at CCN. And what we wanted to do here was try and reconcile some findings about these very clear differences between different neural network models that we saw on the model metamers with other results which showed that these models are actually quite similar on brain-based benchmarks. So as this example, we showed that the model metamers show that adversarial training improves the alignment with human perception. So there's a clear benefit from having adversarial training. But actually the encoding models for fMRI responses evoked by auditory stimuli not only predict the voxels equally well for both the standard and the adversarially trained model, but actually the correlations for the individual sounds at a voxel level is very, very, very correlated between the two. And so what this means is that they're predicting the responses equally well, and they're also predicting the responses in the same way. So it seems right that we have kind of this, this problem where these two models seem to be both equally good at the brain data. They're very clearly different on the model metamer test. And so what we really wanted to know here is this about the stimulus set? Is it because the encoding models for the fMRI data are only testing natural images? So the idea here is that we'll synthesize controversial sounds that minimize the correlation of the predictions, and this is really inspired by work on controversial stimuli by Tal and Nico, which I'm sure that Tal will talk about soon. But the problem with actually doing this with brain data is that there's lots of different neural responses with lots of predictions. So what we actually did here is synthesize a full set of sounds that will simultaneously decorrelate the predictions across all neural responses. And we found that this worked shockingly well. We generated a set of 60 stimuli in fMRI data that we already had, and then we were able to show that the decorrelation of the predictions held for a completely separate set of fMRI participants. And additionally, we then can ask whether one of these models is better than the other at predicting responses for these, what we're calling universally controversial sounds, because they're universally controversial across all of the auditory voxels. And what we see is that on these controversial stimuli, the robust model is clearly better. And so this shows that actually these models are not the same in terms of their neural data. It's just that we weren't actually testing them with the correct set of stimuli. Okay, so now I will very quickly run through the idea behind a third project, which also touches on this idea of generating stimuli to distinguish between different models. And so the work that I talked about so far and the work that many others talk about is really about similarities in what we would call the global geometry of representation. So this would be kind of the overall representation across the whole space of stimuli. But the thing is we can't ever test all example stimuli on some data set, even in a model, right? The number of stimuli that you would need to test to sample this entire space is absolutely huge. And so it's the case that you could have representational geometry that appears very similar globally, but can differ locally. So just to zoom in for what I mean by local, we have one base stimulus here, and we see that, that if you have sort of a 2D visualization, where if you move in particular directions in stimulus space, the model representations may be more or less sensitive to that particular direction in the model representation space. And so we might have these distortions that are equal length in stimuli space, but actually are very different in the model representation space. And so one way actually to think about this is adversarial examples where there's a very small difference in the input that can lead to a large difference in the output. And so in this work, we designed local distortions that would efficiently test differences in local geometry for many models. And model sensitivities are quantified using the Fisher information matrix. The method is essentially finding these distortions that is going to maximally separate out all of the models according to their local geometry. And once again, time is up, so I can't dig into this, but luckily we do have a poster on Friday. And so please come by to hear about this method and also to see how we're using this to sort of tell differences between different neural networks that are trained on different architectures or different data sets. Okay, so I have powered through 3 different projects touching on model metamers, universally controversial stimuli, and finally principal distortions. And for all of these, I have many amazing collaborators collaborators. Now, in the last 10 seconds, I want to actually pose one more question, which is, do humans have universal representations? And I'm going to strongly answer here, no, they do not. And I think that this is a great example of why we know that humans do not have universal representations. And so potentially understanding model idiosyncrasies may actually help us better understand individual differences in human perception, and we shouldn't necessarily ignore differences that we're seeing in our models. Okay, with that, thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much for organizing this talk, Nico, everybody else. So I'm going to give a talk about how we can, across many, many models, scale up these analyses of identifying dimensions of idiosyncrasy and dimensions of universality using metrics through a lens of linear decoding. So I'm going to jump right into the questions, and I think the main question that we're supposed to, fight over is: are neural network representations universal, or do they have non-shared features? And I think, like many of the other speakers, I'm going to strategically evade giving a definitive answer to this question, and instead say I think there's really compelling elements of universality and idiosyncrasy. And I'll use this slide to highlight some really compelling work that I wasn't involved in at all. So on the universality side, I want to quickly highlight this work on model stitching, which I think makes a very compelling case, at least if you look at neural networks with the same architecture, that you can use really simple stitching layers to transfer essentially the computational elements of one network onto another with very little drop in performance. So I think that's a very compelling functional demonstration that these hidden layer representations can be transferred and reused. And then on the other side, I'd point to, out of the many studies, this really recent and I think elegant work by Doshi, Fell, Konkel, and Alvarez, which uses this clever visual anagram stimuli to show that there are large differences across different artificial networks when it comes to image recognition in terms of texture processing versus shape processing. So these are, I think, just two very compelling pieces of evidence that there are idiosyncratic as well as universal representations in neural networks. And something I like about both of these studies is that they're both functional, right? They deal with the actual accuracy score or output of the networks. So that leads me into what I'm going to spend most of this talk about, and which I find most interesting, is how do we quantify the amount of idiosyncrasy or universality? And I think that can help adjudicate some of these debates. So my group has been very interested in how do you quantify these things at scale across networks for several years now. And the way that we have been approaching this problem is leaning strongly on this idea of geometric invariances. So by this, what I mean is that if you have two different neural network representations, network X and network Y, each of these networks define feature spaces. Each point in this feature space is a different input, for example, an image. And you can posit that there are some kind of nuisance transformations that you want to quotient out of these representations. So one way of defining how similar or different these representations are is by fitting a rotation and a reflection that aligns these point clouds, and then you can measure the distance within the aligned space. So this is a notion of distance called the Procrustes distance. The Procrustes distance, as well as its close cousins, which are also based on these geometric invariances, I would argue have some good properties. There's an asterisk next to good that if I had more than 9 minutes, I could go into. But at least for certain tasks, if you want to scale up large-scale analyses of different network representations, doing things like finding clusters of networks with similar representations to each other, for example, I'd argue that you want distance metrics that have some ground rules in terms of the distance being symmetric between two networks. And also when you're looking at more than just two networks at a time, you want these distances to never contradict each other. You want them to be self-consistent in some way. So the Procrustes distance and variants of the Procrustes distance all have these good properties. But a problem of this is that it's purely based on this geometric idea of invariances, and it's not directly, at least, linked to the functional behavior of these representations. So recently, we've been trying to dig into this and see if we can come up with new metrics that define similarity more explicitly in terms of how similar you can decode information from these different representations. And one of the really interesting things we found is that if you motivate representational similarity metrics in terms of this decoding performance, you end up stumbling on metrics that are closely related to familiar characters in this story, namely RSA, CKA, and the Procrustes distance that I already mentioned. I'm not going to tell you about that too much because I think what's more pertinent to this discussion is the fact that you can use this new framework to identify metrics with different decoding probes that explicitly minimize or maximize the distance between networks and thereby expose idiosyncratic or universal features. So the high-level motivation, again, I've kind of said this already, is that we're interested in comparing networks in terms of their functional behavior, and linear decoding, also known as linear probe tasks in the mechanistic AI literature, this is a kind of classic fundamental analysis tool. It's one of the most widely used tools in our field. In neuroscience, it goes back at least to the 1970s, where people were fitting linear decoders to already predict muscle movements from non-human primates really accurately from linear decoders of motor cortex. Obviously in AI, this is a much more recent trend, but this is just to show that there's a full spectrum from neuroscientists over 50 years ago thinking about this to people at Anthropic, OpenAI, and DeepMind that are using these linear probe tasks. Okay, so how can we build metrics out of this? The idea is really simple. Again, if I have two different network representations, I can think of these as embedding inputs into a high-dimensional feature space. A probe task is just a scalar variable that's associated with each input to the network. So if I specify this target pattern or probe, I can fit a linear regression model to predict this probe from network 1, and I can independently fit a second decoder in network 2 to predict the same probe task. And because they're both predicting the same probe, this kind of ties the two networks together, even though their feature spaces may not be directly aligned with each other. And then the idea is very simple, that we're just going to compare the residuals between these models and define a metric space over them. It's very easy to do that. It also satisfies symmetry in the triangle inequality, which, again, I think is important. So that's a sketch of the approach. The interesting thing for the purposes of this discussion is that now we have a framework where we can define different metrics by defining different probe tasks. And that can be used, for example, to expose differences between networks. So just to give you a flavor of how that can work, I'm going to show you a two-dimensional task. So basically, there's two probe tasks here. You can think of these tasks as being orthogonal to each other. Actually, this approach is really closely related to something called contrastive PCA, if people have heard of that before. But basically, we define two probe tasks that are orthogonal to each other. And you can think of this as each point in this space is a two-dimensional position for different image inputs to these models. And these two models, a vision transformer called Dino and a convolutional-based architecture based on ResNet, have the task of finding a linear projection onto a 2D space to match this pattern of activation, more or less. And what happens in this particular case is that the Dino transformer model does a really good job of matching this projection. So you can see it matches the three clusters of images, whereas the ResNet model isn't able to capture this structure as crisply. So this is an example of how you can use our method to explicitly identify metric spaces that push networks apart from each other and expose idiosyncrasy. Okay, and then the final question that we're meant to comment on is, what does this mean for brain alignment? And again, I think the idea I want to leave in your mind is that by leveraging the metric space properties, we can scale up these analyses and get a richer sense of the similarities and differences across networks. So rather than just rank ordering networks in terms of their R squared on brain data, what we can now do is say, what if we specify a probe task, which is predict fMRI data in a particular human participant, and now we can measure all networks that we're interested in relative to each other based on this predictivity task of neural data. So when doing that, we get a very rich picture now. We can build up, by computing all the pairwise distances between a large ensemble of networks, this distance matrix where each element in the matrix now specifies the distance, the decoding distance between the residuals of network I and J on predicting the human brain. And to visualize this better, we can use multidimensional scaling or other vector embedding approaches to put each network as a point in a three-dimensional space. And now I've colored the points in green as randomly initialized networks, the points in blue as the trained deep networks. These are a large ensemble of vision transformers as well as convolutional networks. And then all the different human participants in red. And what you see, not so surprisingly, is that by training the networks on ImageNet or other self-supervised training procedures, all of the networks move closer to the humans, but there's still a lot of spread within those blue points, which makes sense, right? Because you can have two networks that have a very similar R squared to the brain. They predict the brain activity accurately 95% of the time, but which 5% they make errors on might be different between the two. So now we can tease out these more fine-scale details and investigate it more comprehensively. I think that's all the time we have. There's more information about this project if you're interested. Sarah's going to be presenting a poster this Friday. Both Sarah and David are also around and in the audience somewhere, so you can find them after the break and ask them more questions. There's many interesting connections to, as I mentioned, RSA and CKA in this, as well as Procrustes distance, although the connection there is a little bit more loose. And yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you. So I will dive right in. Okay. So question number 1, are neural network representations universal, or do they also have non-shared features that reflect the architecture, the objective, or the learning rule? I think that at least for objective, we know that it's true. There are non-shared features that reflect the neural network's training task. Here's one great example. This is multidimensional scaling of model-to-model RSA. Each model is depicted as a dot. And as you can see, models trained on different tasks, here depicted in different colors, tend to cluster in distinct clusters. So now, some of you might feel a dissonance, a tension, because you already saw this figure twice. Now it's 3 times in this session. And here we see that when we compare multiple neural networks to human fMRI, all of the models have similar predictive accuracy, similar model-brain alignment. We can also see that in Kate Storr's work. So is there a contradiction? I don't think there is, but we have to be careful. First, in both of these figures, all of the models were trained on the same task, ImageNet classification. Once we compare models that were trained on different tasks, then we see greater variation. And yet, we need to be honest and admit that this variation is not as big as we would expect. You would expect that 2 models that were trained on distinct tasks would have also distinct levels of model-brain alignment. To understand what is going on, it is useful to consider separately 2 different evaluation regimes. Let's start with non-flexible evaluation. So here we compare each model's representations directly to the brain. There's no additional parameter fitting. And the typical result that we can see in this figure, as well as in other studies, is that even the best model is really far from the noise ceiling. So all of the model predictions here are really off. But does that mean that all of these models make the same prediction? We need to remind ourselves that equivalent error magnitudes do not mean equivalent error patterns. Each model makes a multivariate prediction. Here, each model predicts an RDM. So the error that a model makes is a vector in a high-dimensional space. When we look at figures that just quantify the scalar error, we are looking at the length of these vectors. For this reason, the figure on the right is completely consistent with a scenario where all of the models are distinct from the brain, but also from each other. Now let's move to flexible evaluation. Now we allow each model to adapt its features, usually through fitting a linear transformation. And the typical result is that even when we apply cross-validation, many models approach the noise ceiling. In this case, I think it's justified to say that the models make similar, if not equivalent, predictions. But I'm increasingly suspicious, and I think that I'm not alone in this hall, that this is not some intriguing convergence of the models, but some issue with our analysis. The concern, the risk, is that flexible evaluation might be forcing the representations of the different models to be very close to the brain. And by that, we might lose some real differences between the models. I'd like to invite you to a talk on Friday by Itamar Avitan, who looked into this in the context of model-to-behavior alignment. He conducted large-scale model recovery simulations and found that as we increase the level of evaluation flexibility, we gain predictive accuracy as expected, but that comes at the cost of diminishing our ability to correctly identify the model that underlies the data. Okay, question number 2. Are features not shared among A and N representations necessarily misaligned with the brain? Let's formally define this as the strong universality hypothesis. It means that if a feature is non-shared across A and N's, it is misaligned with the brain. And as a consequence, if it is aligned, it is shared. If we'll think about an Euler diagram over some feature space, then this hypothesis states that the highlighted regions must have 0 area. It should look like this. Can this be true? I don't think so. We have many cases in which we do see significant advantage of one neural network model over another, despite using flexible evaluation. Each of these cases provides evidence that the winning model has some brain-aligned features that are missing from the losing model. And since flexible evaluation can downweight misaligned features in the losing model, these do not provide an alternative explanation. Okay? So we can confidently reject the strong universality hypothesis, but I do think that there's place for a more nuanced, weak universality hypothesis. After all, if we think about the brain as just another neural net fitted to the external world, then it makes sense that there will be a positive correlation between the prevalence of a feature across A and N's and the probability that it will be encoded also by the brain. But a positive correlation does not entail that all model-specific features will be necessarily misaligned. Okay? Question number 3. What empirical tests would adjudicate this debate? I think that we have a consensus that it's not a binary question. We need to build a more nuanced view on shared and non-shared features. 2 things that I think that we should do. One is to have better characterization of the error patterns. Just measuring scalar accuracy is not enough. There are already some interesting works in this direction, for example, using variance partitioning. We need more of that. And second, we should pay greater attention to non-shared features. And one way of doing that is to present our subjects with controversial stimuli, which are stimuli designed to elicit distinct predictions in different models. And I would like to highlight two posters in this talk. You already saw one that apply this approach in interesting ways. One open challenge that we have with generating controversial stimuli, using them in experiments, is that when we create a controversial stimulus set, it may highlight non-shared yet aligned features, and it may also highlight non-shared misaligned features. And this might depend on the models and also on the optimization procedure. This is a space that we'd like to learn to navigate. One approach that we started to develop is to optimize stimulus sets for disagreement across models, and at the same time for agreement among the realizations of each model, different random weight initializations. Okay, so let me summarize. Different neural networks don't learn the same representation, although I admit that some of the representation is shared. Some non-shared features are brain-aligned. But depending on the decisions we make with our data analysis and experimental design, we may either highlight these features or obscure them. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. So this is really challenging for me. I'm trying to wrap my head around all these great insights, and I'm going to try to look back on some of the things that people have said just now. Oops, this is the wrong direction. So Mick has looked at all the features in neural network models and has analyzed the degree to which different ANNs share features, looking at PCs and how well these PCs can be predicted from the features of other neural network models. And he's shown you that features that are prominent among many ANNs are also prominent in the brain. They tend to be well aligned with brain responses. And then at the other end of the spectrum, features that are not really shared among ANNs tend to be model idiosyncratic features that are less aligned with brains, and maybe they're just noise features also. There's still a little bit of a puzzle there, I think. So this was looking at all the different features in ANNs and looking for agreement and disagreement between models, and then looking at how that relates to brain alignment and finding that the features that are more shared between models are also more brain aligned. Eghbal took a kind of analogous approach, but what he looked for was stimulus sets that make the models agree or disagree. And when he looked at stimulus sets represented similarly in many ANNs, he found that they are also similarly represented in the brain. And when he looked at model-model controversial stimuli, which by definition are stimuli that the models disagree over, then these also tended to be differently represented in the human brain. And he showed that that was the case for vision models as well as language models. So the universalists seem to argue that when there's low representational agreement among ANNs, that implies a divergence from the brain. And in Mick's work, it was looking at different feature subsets, and in Eghbal's, it was looking at different stimulus subsets. And when there's high representational agreement among ANNs, then they see a convergence with the brain. And so they argue, doesn't this suggest that the similarity between ANNs and brains arises from a universal representation that they both learn? The particularists say, not so fast. Isn't it a foregone conclusion that they should share many feature dimensions? So these are all vision models. So shouldn't vision models... I think I should quickly stop this presentation and restart it because it hasn't updated. How do I do this? Oh, here, right? I made my slides while the other people were speaking, so I think I need to just noticing. This is better. So, yeah, I hadn't heard their talks, right? How can I summarize without having heard their... So the particularists argue, isn't it a foregone conclusion that all visual systems should share many feature dimensions? After all, they all represent the same visual world, right? So it's all the same world that drives it. So all the information comes from the world. There are certain factors that explain major variance just in the input. And is it really surprising that lots of qualitatively different models, maybe even trained with different objectives, capture some of those major variance components? The particularists say the interesting thing is the particular signature of each model, even if it doesn't explain the most variance necessarily. So they say, let's find the unique features and adjudicate among distinct mechanistic hypotheses. And there's this idea that the models implement different theories. We want to make theoretical progress, so we want to focus on the differences between models. We want to be good scientists that design experiments that help us adjudicate between our theories implemented in these computational models. Brian Cheung gave the machine learning perspective that supports a lot of these exciting ideas about universal representations. So they looked at a range of different language models with a range of different levels of performance. And then they looked at the alignment of the representations learned by those language models to vision models. And the vision models also had a range of different levels of performance. So what's plotted on the vertical axis here is the alignment between vision and language models. And what we can see is that when you're looking at a language model that is stronger in performance, it's also more aligned to each of the vision models. And it's true for each of the vision models. And when you look at a different vision model that's stronger in terms of vision performance, it tends to be more aligned to the language model, even though what it's optimized for is vision. So this is really an exciting idea that suggests that despite these totally different modalities, both classes of models learn something deeper about the world that is reflected in both the text corpora that the language models are trained with and the large sets of images that the vision models are trained with. So the idea is that there is this, this world out there, and that's reflected in vision and is reflected in language, and the deeper latent structure of the world is what these models really pick up on. And just to make that more intuitive, one particular aspect of the structure of the world that I think these models pick up on is the co-occurrence statistics of the world. For example, think of a fork and a knife. Forks and knives co-occur in images, and they also co-occur in text corpora. Right? Similarly, cats and dogs, and maybe a fork and a cat, not so much. That can happen, but it's less frequent, right? And you expect that these kinds of structure, and that's not the only kind of structure, of course, much deeper than that, but it is intuitive that there is structure that these models would pick up on that is shared and that comes from the latent variables of the world. Jenelle Feather took the approach of looking at metamares, and metamares are stimuli that are not distinguished by some representation of interest. So this is looking at the local geometry where we ask, is the representational distance between two stimuli 0 or is it not 0? If the representational distance for some representation is 0, then those two stimuli are metamares for that representation. And she made these kinds of metamares and then looked at how recognizable they are to other models as well as to humans. And her data support both the universalist and the particularist perspective. So there was some universalist support in that invariances shared among the models tended to also be shared with humans. But there was also support for the particularist perspective, because human model discrepancy she found to be largely due to model-specific invariances. Alex Williams presented an exciting generalization of representational geometry and linear decoding analyses, where representational similarity analysis and the centered kernel alignment measure, in a sense, the full geometry. And as he showed, representational distances in these methods reflect the expected decodability for random readouts. So this is like random projections. You can look at random directions of the representational space, and the expected discriminability that you get, that's actually the squared Euclidean distance after normalization. But you can also measure representational geometry in decoding subspaces of particular interest. So that's a way of tuning representational geometry analyses to particular dimensions that we care about. And in particular, he showed the possibility of having a worst case probe task that makes two ANNs look as different as possible, or a best case probe task that makes two ANNs look very similar. And one example that he showed was taking prediction of the fusiform face area, the human fusiform face areas measured with fMRI, those dimensions as the decoding dimensions, that defines a representational subspace for each model, where you can then relate the models to each other. And here's a 3D plot that he showed where each dot is one of the models, and you see the separation between the randomly initialized deep networks and the ImageNet trained networks, which are closer to the human left hemisphere FFA. Tal argued that one challenge is flexible evaluation of the models. Often we want to allow our models some parameters to fit them to our brain data. So we don't only set the parameters by task training, but we also fit, for example, linear encoding models or weighted representational models. We give them some level of flexibility. And then, of course, we have to test and cross-validation. But this flexibility, Tal argued, can mask model differences. And in their presentation on Friday, they will show that there is a trade-off between model prediction accuracy and model adjudication power, where when you want your, when you have a very flexible evaluation strategy, you're going to do better at predicting the brain data, but with all of the models, and you're going to be worse at discriminating the models from each other. Right? So that's a really interesting challenge for empirical work, where we want to make theoretical progress by adjudicating among models, where we care really about which model is relatively better. So here in the top left corner, we have flexible evaluation, where there's high accuracy, but little power to adjudicate among models. And in the lower right corner, we have rigid evaluation, where you have lower accuracy at predicting the brain responses, but you have good power to see differences between models that can drive theoretical progress. Right? So our only goal shouldn't be to predict the brain data. That's not the ultimate goal. It's just something we use to have theoretical insights. Right? And that's a key point here. Tal also argued that models have non-shared human-aligned features that are of theoretical interest. So in other words, we can think of these features as, in terms of this Euler diagram, and these non-shared yet aligned feature subsets there are not empty. We know that they're not empty, and Tal is arguing that they're of theoretical interest. So one theme that ran through a lot of these presentations I noted was an interest in revealing model disagreement by looking for different things. And that is something that the universalists and the particularists share. So they're looking for non-shared features, so what the different models are sensitive to. They're looking for non-shared invariances, so what different models are not sensitive to. That's also something that uniquely characterizes a particular model. For non-shared decoding dimensions, and for stimuli that make models disagree. So this is quite intriguing and went through a number of these talks. And we have to think for me, it's sort of a little bit mind-boggling. I was trying to quickly piece this together. What does this all mean? The first three here are about understanding model differences. And that's obviously very important if we think of our models as implementing our theories. We want to understand our own models very well. And the final one here is about good experimental design. And of course, this is, as Tal showed, this process of making controversial stimuli that are controversial between the models with optimization techniques where we can create these images that really elicit responses from the models that are in disagreement in terms of their predictions about our data. So, but we don't only want to look for disagreements. Another major theme today was looking for agreement, right? So we've also seen people look for shared features, shared sensitivities, shared invariances, shared decoding dimensions, and that's about understanding model similarities, and that's obviously also very important and complementary. Right? So if we think about the stimulus then, we want to find stimuli, as Eghbal did, that make the models agree. And these are uncontroversial stimuli. Right? So you find two stimuli that are just different in every respect so that every last model agrees. These are totally different stimuli. And when you do that, of course, you're not doing good experimental design. Right? So we want to be good, but it's also tiring to be good. Sometimes we want to be bad. We want to do bad experimental design. We want to do an experiment that will not allow us to adjudicate between any theories. There's, I think, Edgar Allan Poe had this notion of the imp of the perverse, where you want to shoot yourself in the foot and just do an experiment that will not allow you to make any progress. But that's also fun sometimes because you get a different perspective on things. So let's zoom out a little bit. Some of you will remember in the 80s and 90s there were people arguing that intelligence doesn't require any representations, and that was very inspiring to me and still is. Today we would probably say what they were talking about were kind of minimal task-specific representations, like in Breitenberg vehicles, or like simple pathways from the sensors to the motors that enable a robot or a small animal to act intelligently. So these are task-specific representations. So here on this slide, like a dot is a particular model representation. So you could think of an RDM or a representational geometry. And as we get bigger training data sets and bigger models and also more different modalities and more task diversity, we get different representations. And the representations, perhaps unsurprisingly, become more task general. And the fascinating thing that we heard about from Brian today was that it might make sense to think of all of these representations as converging to a single point where the particular architecture and the particular task that you're learning doesn't matter at all anymore, and the representation only reflects the world in a sense, right? It's sort of totally pure of the arbitrary engineering choices of the model. The model is just big enough, it sort of soaks up the world, and it's a pure representation of the world. So this is a fascinating ideal, it's a fascinating reference point, and like other fascinating reference points, we should be very interested in it, right? Like another one would be probabilistic inference or Bayesian inference, right? It's a fascinating ideal. This one, like Bayesian inference, is simple in the abstract, but complex in its consequences, and it definitely deserves the attention that it's getting, right? So the universalists say, let's understand this limiting case where diverse models learn a universal representation of the world. But then, of course, the brain is not that, right? So the brain is not Bayesian, and the brain does not have a Platonic representation. However, maybe it approaches something like that, right? So there is a point, and as we move toward bigger models and richer training regimes and more diverse tasks, we're pushing up here, and for a while we're going to get closer and closer to the brain, but at some point that's not going to work anymore, and that's because the human brain is general in certain respects, right? We have a kind of general, surprisingly general, amazing intelligence, but our intelligence is not really fully general. It's also domain-specific. And the particularists argue, let's understand the actual human brain, which is limited in terms of data, space, time, and energy. So it has limited data, experiential data to learn from. It has a limited size. It needs to fit into the skull. And it has limited time. We have limited time to think. We have to, act quickly. And we also have to run our brain at low energy, like 20 watts, much lower than current AI systems. And it's sort of these limitations that make the brain interesting and that make cognitive computational neuroscience interesting, right? It's like the hero is interesting for his flaws, right? Otherwise, if if there's no resource constraints, then yes, you can go to the Platonic representation. You will go to the Platonic representation when the more general distribution that you're learning is not so complex that the model cannot fully capture it, right? So I think we should also remember that the world is much more complex than these distributions, even across vision and language models that we're considering here. All brains and models are much simpler than the world that they are a part of, after all, right? So it's in these compromises that brains and models have to strike that, for me, the magic resides. But we also should work to understand these limiting cases, right? So my somewhat opinionated last point would be that the ideal of Platonic representations is limited to particular distributions of inputs and tasks that the model or brain has ample capacity to capture. Thank you.
If the panelists can take seats, I just want to make a small comment on Nico's presentation, and you can still see that last slide, right? So Jenelle's comment and something I was thinking about yesterday made me think about approaches in human cognition and human cognitive neuroscience, where there's also these two classes of approaches, right? An approach where we try to model the average mind, the average brain, which requires averaging across a bunch of people to find some shared features, and studies of individual differences, which focus on trying to find dimensions along which individuals fall. And of course, nobody would say that all humans are the same, but there's a huge amount that we share, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't want to be in relationships with one another, right? We couldn't connect to each other. So maybe one way to think about it is in those terms of trying to find whatever is shared across us, across models, between us and models, as well as these peculiarities. But I would note, a note of caution is that a lot of human individual differences research at various points has dissolved into these weird descriptive things where it's like, yes, individuals vary in this way and in this way and in this way. And it kind of didn't always have interesting theoretical properties. So just like that, I feel like we might dissolve into that a little bit if we focus on model particularities, if we don't know what those relate to. But if we can say, okay, these models differ in this representational way, and we can relate it to, say, some property of their architecture, some property of whatever they're trained on, then there's interesting insights to be gained there. But anyway, so just to...
Okay, so we'll finish this part with a fourth shared question. What are the implications for cognitive computational neuroscience? So, Mick.
I'm just going to pass the mic around. Yeah. Okay, thanks. So what are the implications here? I think that one implication is that I think there was a time when we were hopeful that we could learn a lot by focusing on these sort of ingredients for like a recipe of deep learning, task, architecture, training data. And those don't seem to be the key factors to focus on, in my opinion. So it suggests that we should spend more time trying to understand the nature of the representations themselves. So one example of this is trying to get at a parsimonious explanation of these universal representations. And another is actually exactly what Ev was just pointing out, which is that to the extent that we see particularist representations, we should really strive for mechanistic explanations, not just saying two models differ from each other, but a deep understanding of why they differ. What is it about the underlying mechanism that gives rise to that? And then the last thing is that I think we want to move beyond examining these models that we're just grabbing from the AI world. I mean, I don't think that we're going to find like the best matching DNN that we grab from GitHub, the best match to the brain, and that's going to tell us how the brain works. Right. I think what we need to do is step away from this, like grabbing these AI models and go after simpler models that get at how these representations might emerge under more biologically plausible conditions.
Yeah, I can just go to the next slide. I just talk over it. So I think one thing that I want to sort of emphasize is this notion of focusing on natural stimuli, but still trying to embed on our hypothesis testing on stimulus design process. I think in the AI field, at least, like sort of this focus on natural training data set, natural stimuli have been more productive than focusing on particular unnatural stimuli that could elicit a sort of a response that could say something about the model, but not necessarily useful in thinking about what good representations are. And I think, and the other aspect is sort of, I think right now the field is very focused on searching for the most brain-like model. And I think that could be complemented with approaches that try to understand what already existing model can capture and what can tell us, what that can tell us about where to go when designing new models. And I also want to point out that sort of there's been this focus on models as our mechanistic hypotheses, and to me, models are instantiation, and what we're after are sort of representation themselves. Like, what are the good hypotheses about representations, be it in an artificial neural network or another model? So it could be that we need to sort of move beyond just looking at singular models and looking at distribution of models to extract what good representation or hypotheses are. Yeah.
Great. Let me see what I wrote yesterday. So yeah, I think one of the big things is that a common theme among all these kind of discussions is this notion that we're kind of creating these representational Turing tests. You know, what inputs, what kind of things would make these models different from each other, and we could tell them apart versus what makes them universal or similar to each other. And I think one of the questions is this notion of we're measuring it from a reference point of the brain. And I would argue that for certain types of scenarios, maybe more alignment isn't always better, and less alignment isn't always worse. And we have to think about situations where that's true and that's not true, especially I think going into the future. And I think that I'd also like to say that, you know, intelligence is a very general thing. I think we're starting to realize that there's many ways to be intelligent and ways that maybe aren't as human-like as we thought before. And another inequality I'd like to pose to you is this fact that more intelligence doesn't necessarily mean more brain-like. For example, if we want AlphaGo to play more human-like, it actually might play worse. And maybe that's not a desirable thing that we want in our models. And lastly, I'd like to ask a question to the community, which is this idea that are there conditions where more alignment is always better? Are there situations where we can create this identifiable space where we want alignment between humans and machines, and it's always strictly a better scenario than we have when we have that alignment? So I think this is, you know, particularly important for the neuro AI community, because I think we're going to have questions of whether we should continue to be aligned with the AI community with the models that we build versus the models that they create.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Ignore my slide for a second because I actually want to sort of follow up on a couple of the other really interesting things that people have said. So first off, I totally... I totally agree with Brian about thinking about the similarities and differences between representations in terms, at least for me, I think about this in terms of the similarities with the human brain, which is not actually sort of the Platonic representation, as also Nico pointed out. And so I think that in that sense, like a lot of us are in agreement. But if we're interested in studying the human brain or just biological brains in general, then we want to think about like how our models could potentially be wrong, and then how that leads to different representations in the model. And then this also gets back, I think, to some of these idiosyncrasies that we see among models, to get to Ev's point of individual differences among models and how much we should take them seriously. And I actually totally agree that to the extent that many of the idiosyncrasies, at least from my own experiments on metamers that we saw, we basically were like, well, actually you can remove a lot of these idiosyncrasies from the models, and so we should just do that because they actually then do align better with a typical human observer. And so I think that makes sense. But what's really exciting, I think, to me, is that we are now in this stage of having so many models and really good modeling tools that we could potentially actually try and ground some of these things that, like in classic cognitive science, where people would talk about individual differences, but then you're not really able to characterize it particularly well. Whereas now our models do go back to the stimulus. They are stimulus computable. We can feed it a sentence, we can feed it a speech phrase, we can feed it an image, and potentially actually try and ground some of these very interesting differences. Okay, so with that, I guess I do want my slide now, because I think that many of the ways that we can start to make progress here, and so that's what are the implications for research, is really about the data sets. And so I think that this has come up in many different cases in terms of natural stimuli versus using synthetic stimuli. And so I really think that one way to push forward on this is by using synthetic stimuli. And so I'm also just going to take this opportunity to plug 2 different places where you can see some of these approaches or potentially contribute your own work. So we have a NeurIPS workshop which is data on the brain and mind. And so we're soliciting a call for, this is non-archival. So basically if you have anything that fits into data sets that you maybe want to share with people or interesting things that you've done on data, that would be a great place to send stuff. And then also along these lines, there's a special issue of Journal of Vision, which is explicitly about choosing stimuli. And so I think that some of the topics that we're talking about today could potentially be really a good fit for that. Yeah, so thank you for letting me plug both of these 2 submission venues.
I didn't make a slide, but I should have plugged the workshop that I'm involved with, Unireps at Neurips, which I'll take a second to plug that. I think it's a great community. It's been running for a few years. And yeah, there's actually both a non-archival and a proceedings track. It's a great place to submit papers on these kind of like fundamental analyses involving neural representations. So I didn't make a slide because I wasn't sure what I was going to say. I wanted to mostly respond to what other speakers said. And I guess I'll go back to, I really liked all of Mick's comments at the beginning, and Eghbal maybe touched on some similar themes. I think I'll reiterate the point that, you know, maybe once upon a time we thought that our goal was to find like the best model of the brain, but I think more and more the field is moving towards this model of there being many potential models and in trying to characterize the distribution over models that naturally emerge in these modern training paradigms. And so that's what, you know, our work is motivated by, is trying to think about ways that you can characterize these things at scale, because I think that is a challenge that we haven't fully figured out how to overcome, which is if you have 1,000 models that all are doing something different, how do you make sense of that? And I guess the other thing that I'll point out as like a real challenge for the future, and you know, we've really barely, if at all, scratched the surface on this, is I would really like us to see make progress over the next 5 years about linking all of these universal or idiosyncratic features of models explicitly to a kind of human understandable account of what these models are actually doing. Like, these deep neural networks are, you know, on the surface, very simple feed-forward cascades of really simple calculations. The representation is just changing a little bit, layer to layer. And I think, you know, if we're ever going to understand how human visual processing works, it's a prerequisite that we should be able to do that for some of these networks. So I would like us to, you know, even though, you know, I love geometry and thinking about linear decoding and all these things are very useful tools, again, I think they're useful because they're scalable. We can apply them to large ensembles. I wish we, you know, had at this point made more progress to linking these things to what, like, you could call an algorithmic understanding of what these networks are actually doing. I don't know how we get there, but I hope somebody in the room does.
I'll try to be extremely short. I discovered that Mick and I agree more than I expected. And I would like to just use this opportunity to warn against a dangerous combination. If we test our models only on natural stimuli within distribution and we use highly flexible evaluation, then we are operating in a regime in which it is very difficult to see model differences. Okay, so now let's move to some audience questions. So we both have questions on Slido, and we can also accept questions live.
Yeah, so these questions here.
Just a quick comment, they're not only just trained on human tasks, but they're fine-tuned to predict the brain, right? So this is, I think Tal made this point really nicely in his talk and in his comments, that if you have an expressive decoder to predict the neural activity from these models, then of course, I mean, these deep networks are learned to do general tasks on, you know, in the visual domain. Like Dino, for example, is not just, I mean, it's trained on like a self-supervised task, but then you can fine-tune it to do object classification or depth perception or all these other tasks. Predicting the human brain response to a visual stimulus is just another task for fine-tuning. And the alignment is even, it becomes more and more trivial, I would say, the more expressive that fine-tuning procedure is. So we should really keep that in mind, that like how you actually quantify the alignment involves this step of fine-tuning.
Yeah, I think this is one of those situations where when we were writing the Platonic representation paper, we weren't sure if it was obvious or not obvious, in the sense that, yes, these models are trained on tasks that we as capabilities want these models to do, right? So it should become as no surprise that if the models can accomplish all the capabilities that we can accomplish, they become more similar to us. And I think this is why I like this notion of viewing capabilities as the measure of how we see alignment, because I think that will be the thing that won't change as these models maybe surpass us in certain dimensions or do things that we would like to do. And I think this is why I think there's this human bias of intelligence being a capability aligned thing.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that as our models are trained on human data, then we're biasing them to be more human aligned. But that being said, the amount of data that we would need from human observers in order to fully align our models is totally infeasible. Like if we wanted to test, so I can't remember exactly the statistic, but basically in the vision domain, if you wanted to test every single image that was like a 256 by 256 image, it would be something like, I think like 100 times the number of atoms in the universe in terms of the individual pixel values that you would get for a typical representation. And so the fact that we have models that are becoming more human aligned as we get more human data definitely makes sense, but there's also some implicit biases in the architectures or in the way that we're training our models that is going to allow them to generalize to cases that are outside of the training distributions, either like better or worse than other models trained on the same data.
I'll just add one caveat here, which is the wording of this question was about human tasks or human relevant tasks or something. I actually think that what the finding suggests is that the success of these models is determined by training on human generated data, like images of the natural world that we take and text that we generate. The task actually doesn't seem that important, and some of the tasks are really not human related tasks. Like, I mean, in vision, some of the self-supervised tasks are really bizarre, like solving a jigsaw puzzle with an image, right? So I think it's about the data, not the task.
All right, next question is from Nakshi, and this is about inter-individual variability and studying it with models. How do we link model variability to inter-individual variability? So the question is, what mechanisms of variability will we need across models if we want to model idiosyncrasies to help us understand human differences? So are different seeds and different architectures enough, or do we want to fit models to individual human subjects?
I think this is a great question, and it's very open.
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, then Eghbal, you can jump in. I think that what's really, and I sort of said this before, is that what's really interesting is we can now actually start to build these models. So like we could potentially train models on individual human observers, or we could have models that have different architectures that have different biological constraints that we think would be representative of particular diseases or neurological disorders, and see then what the end representations look like. Eghbal, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I think we showed sort of two pieces of evidence, both in behavioral and neural, where we could elicit rating differences across humans in sort of few features that we sort of hand design and come up with, and we could already see differences across humans. So I think that was sort of motivated by starting with the models and trying to sort of use the models as sort of, in a way, statistical distributions with slightly different priors, and sort of use that as a way to point out where the differences in humans could lie. And we also sort of could do the same thing with like human neural data and show that we can get modulation across models. So I think, again, it would be, if we were to use natural stimuli, we would have a much easier time finding differences across humans. So there's already evidence there, yeah.
I also want to add that I think much like our models are being trained and optimized, we're also optimizing to finding the things that are similar or different. And we should consider the aspect of, if we're optimizing it, what's the definition of like overfitting in this regime, right? What is the definition of interesting things that are overfit versus like idiosyncrasies or things that are not that interesting? Same thing for things that are overlapping. Like I think we're always going to find things that are, you know, in either the intersecting things of the two circles versus in the outside. And we have to define now whether they're interesting or not and how we find them, because if we systematically look for them, we're definitely going to find both of them in both places. Yeah.
All right, next question. Are we done with this one? Do you want to?
No, last one.
Last question. This is about representation and computation. Representations change as a function of mental processes, thinking and reasoning. Do the universalists expect Platonic processes as well, not just Platonic representations? For example, Platonic reasoning strategies.
So I will say that we're looking into this right now. I think unsurprisingly, maybe we would say that it's leaning towards the answer is yes, towards the reasoning processes. But yeah, you can ask me later about the details of that, yeah.
Other universalists want to?
I mean, so I don't know about reasoning. I mean, I haven't thought about that much. But like in the context of vision, I do think that there are canonical computations. And so yes, I would say that there probably are something like universal processes, yeah.
I also want to just bring up one additional point, which I kind of have a question for other panels and maybe this, the audience, where are we still in the era of comparing models as hypotheses, or do we need to think and move beyond that? Because I think that's where a lot of the details of experimental design sit.
I think that's a great question. Does one of the particularists want to respond?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can comment briefly. I think I'm trying to figure out what to say without being too provocative in the last 2 minutes. I think my personal feeling is that I feel very comfortable applying these analyses. You know, in particular, we work on metric spaces. That's kind of our shtick in this area. I feel very comfortable taking 1,000 deep net models that have been trained on the, you know, similar data sets, similar task, similar optimizers, et cetera. Comparing them, it feels very apples to apples, putting them in a single space and mapping out all these similarities and differences. I also feel, going back to Meenakshi's question, very comfortable taking neural data from multiple humans, if it's fMRI, or, you know, non-human primates or rodent models, and again, comparing within that study where they have, you know, multiple subjects, replicates in the same procedure, applying these analyses and doing, again, apples to apples comparison. I feel very uncomfortable making direct comparisons from model to brain. I've always felt this way. There's just so many differences. I mean, this could be my background really coming from systems level neuroscience, working with single neurons that are very noisy, communicate with each other in terms of spikes, and just the mechanism of representation there just feels very different than a deterministic feed-forward deep network. There are some, you know, if you inject noise into the networks, or, I mean, there's also this whole branch of work on making spiking neural networks do things that are non-trivial and can actually approach at least some of these behaviors of complicated deep net models. I mean, nobody has trained a spiking neural network to beat human Go players, for example. But anyway, that's just a long-winded way of saying, like, I personally think there's a lot of unexamined assumptions, and it would be a whole nother session to really think carefully about the model-to-brain comparisons.
Before everyone goes, so we have a hackathon on Thursday afternoon, and I think this goal of this hackathon is to have the communities come together and interact. And the idea would be that there'd be different communities, like the red team, which is looking for particularity, that's interacting with the blue team to find stimuli that are interesting to tell models apart. And for the blue team's view, find maybe interesting model sets where alignment is surprisingly high and interact with the red team to see where they can find stimuli that are different. So this is our hackathon. And today, after this talk, actually, we're going to have a social at this restaurant. I think you should take a picture of it. I can't really pronounce any of those words. But I'll be there. My co-organizers, Doda, will also be there. Aaron Grant and Lucas Motenthaler will also be there. Thank you.